Welcome and thank you for stopping by Sheila's Audiobooks, and I am Sheila. This recording is coming from South Texas. All stories on this recording are in the public domain per United States copyright law. These stories were first published around April 1910. They are about Lord Lister called John C. Raffles, the most brilliant among all thieves. He is the terror of usurers and moneylenders, robs them of their possessions by his wiles, protecting beleaguered innocence and supporting the needy. Man of honor in all respects. He persuaded that many abuses, protected by law, continue to proliferate with impunity. Every effort is made to apprehend Lord Lister, called John C. Raffles, the most brilliant of thieves. Reward, £1,000 sterling. Lord Lister, the $1 Million Treasure in the Coffin. By Kurt Matchell and Theo Blakenzy. Chapter 1. A Button Call. Hush, Charlie. Go read the Novoge Remja and don't interfere with me or the table next to us. Raffles whispered these words almost without moving his lips as he reclined, like a real man of the world, in his armchair. This conversation took place in the dining room of the Hotel St. Petersburg, the main one in the city of Irkutsk. Grand calm reigned in the great hall, where a heavy oriental carpet muffled every footstep and the waiters moved silently. Among the elegant apparitions seated at tables heavily laden with crystal and silver was John C. Raffles. Seemingly lost in thought, he listened very carefully to the conversation at the neighboring table. Two gentlemen sat there arguing. One wore the richly decorated uniform of a Russian general, the other was in a tuxedo. The conversation was conducted in hushed tones and seemed to be intended for no foreign ears. Charlie Brand, the friend, or, as he was called, the Lord Secretary, had apparently absorbed himself completely in the Novojvemja, but in reality he listened to his neighbors, too. However, he did not understand a word of what was spoken. Hiding, he looked again at Raffles's face, which was icy calm and whose eyes looked round indifferently. But Charlie knew his friend's gestures far too well not to notice at once that a conversation was going on at the neighboring table, which not only interested Raffles lively, but also angered him. The two gentlemen now stopped talking and left the dining room. Scarcely had this happened when Raffles called the waiter. This appeared immediately. Who are those two gentlemen who just left the hall? His Excellency the Governor of Irkutsk Orstkov and Count Baryatinsk, his district chief. Where are they staying? Rooms 38 and 39 on the first floor. Thank you. The waiter left. Charlie Brand couldn't contain his curiosity any longer. Edward, he said, what are you up to? He trembled with excitement, for his friend's cold, sphinx-like face, carved as if of marble, told him all too plainly that Raffles was once again up to something extraordinary. He understood that his friend had heard the conversation of the gentleman. But Lord Lister was not one to flaunt his secrets, not even to his friend Brand, who, as Raffles said, was so terribly nervous. Edward, I beg you. Tell me what's happening. I tremble for your life. Lister laughed. Pooh. You're always trembling, Charlie. You have to unlearn that. You don't change me. And why not, Edward? That is not a life to be always full of fear and worry. Stop those dangerous undertakings. I'm sure your brains have hatched some madness again, and what if that were so? Then I'd beg you to drop those mad plans for your own sake, or I must leave you. You are a big child, Charlie. Raffles lit a cigarette. No, Edward, I am not a child. On the contrary. I see beyond you. Your tricks will once more get to the gallows. Isn't that what you mean, Charlie? Well, why not? I also want to get to know the noose. Fire faded. His eyes opened wide. Lord Lister laid his hand on his friend's arm. Listen, Charlie, You shouldn't make such funny faces. Really not. You betray me before I do anything else. Listen. I will acquaint you with my plans to a certain extent. You are my friend and must accompany me. Do you want to leave? I have to. Why? Because I can't stand those villains. Who do you speak of? From the two fellows who sat at the table next to ours. From the general and the chief. Yes. Do you know them? I got to know them. By the waiter? No, by their own conversation. The waiter only mentioned their names and the numbers of their rooms. Why did you want to know it? Because I want to study the villains and their plans closely. How will you do that? We are moving. Where to? To number 36 or 39. And if they are occupied? Lord Lister smiled. You are a real child, Charlie. Don't you know that we are in a Russian hotel and have a lot of money? For a few rubles, the waiters will fix everything here. But why do you want to live in one of those two rooms? Because I want to listen to the villains. They have miscalculated. What have they done wrong to make you so bitter? I'll tell you in our room. I wouldn't stay calm enough here. Are they such bastards? They are more than that. They're vampires. But come now, let us not lose our precious time. Raffles folded his napkin, looked for a moment with pensive glance at the beautiful brilliant on the ring finger of his right hand, put on his top hat, and left the dining room with Charlie Brand. Chapter 2. The Secret of Two Richards. Shaking his head, Charlie Brand had followed his friend. He did not for a moment believe that it was possible to leave the rooms as quickly as Raffles had claimed. But Lord Lister was a better human being than his secretary. Not 10 minutes had elapsed, when already a guest's trunks and clothes were taken to another room, and the two friends had reached their goal. Lord Lister closed the door of the room and then listened at the wall separating number 39 from number 38. As is customary in hotels, there was a door between the two rooms, which was, of course, locked. Brand could no longer contain his impatience. He also went to listen at the door. "PST," whispered Raffles. "Do not do that, you cannot listen, Charlie, and yet understand nothing." "You do?" "Oh yeah." "Is there something important?" "And/or." "What is it, Edward, tell me." Can you shut up, Charlie?" Serious silence. "Did you think I might betray you?" "No. Betrayal I fear not." "Then what?" "Your tongue. I don't expect any warnings." "Edward." "All right, Charlie. I know you. I know you mean well. After all, I do everything out of pure friendship." "Right, my boy. And that's your only excuse. Then tell me at last what you intend to do with those two people." "Good now. I'll tell you. But you must promise me that you will not try to dissuade me from my plan. You'd make me angry and you'll get no further." "I promise, Edward." "Here then. That Governor Ortzkopf with his golden braid and his chest full of knighthoods is a mean scum. He squeezes the money he squanders from the very poorest. Blood and tears cling to all those shamefully earned kopecks." Charlie Brand was stunned. Raffles had lost all coolness. He continued. "The man who is with the general is his district chief Count Bariatinsk, who collects the taxes for him. The two villains have made good business, having just doubled the taxes. Ortzkopf is now out to take the money stolen for him to St. Petersburg. Did you hear all that in the dining room?" "Everything. You know I have an extremely keen ear." "That has done you a great deal of service, Edward. In order not to cause any sensation at all, the general has come up with a cunning idea. He had von Bariatinsk pack everything into a coffin, which apparently contains his uncle's remains. The corpse of the soldier will now be taken to St. Petersburg under strong military escort in a separate freight car. You understand, Charlie, that no one will harm a corpse, even if something happened." "What do you mean, Edward?" Do Do you definitely want to know everything? Yes, you must tell me the whole thing. Now then, the train travels through great plains, in which the poor people live, who are squeezed like a lemon. The lazy have nothing to lose, and their hearts are filled with vengeance, wrath, and bitterness. It wouldn't be the first time if the train was overrun. And what do you want to do now? Can't you really think that now, Charlie? No. You know I cannot follow your presumptuous train of thought. Raffles nodded. And yet it is the most natural thing in the world. Brand grew impatient. You put me to the test, Edward. Don't tease me any more. What in your eyes is the most natural thing in the world? Let me rob the general of his treasure before the Siberians do. Charlie Brand was speechless. He looked at Raffles as if he were a ghost. Robbing the treasure from the coffin, which was guarded by many soldiers. How was he going to do that? After all, that was impossible. Charlie, I need your help, Raffles interrupted suddenly, after listening for another moment at the door. Perhaps in the execution of that crazy plan? Lord Lister smiled. Yes and no. I can't use you in the performance itself, because the hair would stand on your head. But in the preparations, Charlie, I need you. Good. Tell me what I have to do. Now go to the station and inquire when the train that carries the general's corpse is leaving, and in which wagon it lies. How am I supposed to perceive that? Simply simple. The coffin will be guarded by a guard of honor. I'm flying already, replied Brand, glad to be of service. I'll be back soon. Make sure you know everything exactly, Charlie, and order us 2 beds in the sleeping car nearest the coffin. Charlie looked at Raffles. He didn't understand. And the secretary left, shaking his head. Chapter 3. A fatal climbing party. Brand left the room and Raffles carefully bolted her down. He had sent his friend to the station to be alone, for he was up to something he couldn't use a frightened spectator for. Then he opened the balcony door and looked out. It was completely dark, only a few windows were dimly lit. Balconies were arranged behind all the rooms of the hotel, from which the guests could get some fresh air. Lord Lister surveyed the situation carefully. He wanted to get on the balcony of number 38 to see if the residents were staying there or if they might be in the adjoining cubicle. But the gulf between the 2 balconies was deep. Even for a trained gymnast like Raffles, it was no small matter to cross that abyss. But the master thief shrank from nothing. He had resolved to unveil General Ortskov's secret, and now no effort was too great for him. Quickly he fetched his walking stick and a ladder, plaited of horsehair, so thin that he could easily put it in his pocket. The walking stick, like a fishing rod, could be taken apart. But neither the cane nor the rope ladder reached to the next balcony. Lord Lister was not deterred, however. A fire escape ladder hung from the roof of the hotel to the garden between the 2 balconies. So that broke the distance. With great dexterity he swung the rope ladder around the fire escape ladder, then with the extended cane drew the end toward him again, fastened both ends firmly to the balcony on which he stood, and then began to climb on all 4s through the air. It was a breakneck journey, but he ended up on the fire escape unscathed. And now he had to swing to the balcony of number 38. That also worked. As a result of the jump, however, a stone fell in the garden of the hotel. It hit a waiter, who was just passing by. "Hello!" cried the man, looking up. Raffles bent quickly and listened for the waiter to stop. This one waited a while, then went on. Raffles now tried to sense something of what happened in number 38. He couldn't understand a conversation. However, he heard clearly that money was being counted, a lot of money. He took out his drill and very carefully made a hole in the balcony door. Then he looked through it and saw someone who had a mountain of gold in front of him. But what was that? Had Lord Lister been mistaken? Had he ended up in the wrong room? He did not know that man. Raffles had never seen such a villainous face in all his life. It was a face in which devilish rudeness and greed had left their mark. Now and then the money counter let some gold pieces disappear into his pocket, looking shyly at the door leading into the adjoining room. Evil conscience evidently spoke to this fellow. Raffles was convinced that he was here on the trail of a new crime which had nothing to do with the general's villainy. Suddenly the money counter started violently. Quickly he let a handful of gold pieces disappear into his pockets. Then he flew to the door, which had been knocked in a very special way. To Raffles' great surprise, Count Bariatinsk entered the room. He was out of breath and very excited, but nevertheless did not forget to lock the door. Thank God. He released. General Ortskov has traveled with his uncle's corpse. Ha ha. I had to laugh at those dragoons and Cossacks. They stood around the coffin with the greatest reverence. They will transfer the treasure safely. I wouldn't advise anyone to start with those boys, they look like bulldogs, say Pavlov. The man addressed as Pavlov looked up. A spiteful grin spread across his ugly face. Ortskov is going with the treasure to St. Petersburg. I believe we have committed a gigantic stupidity. Why? That we let the governor go. Have we not dropped him off enough? How much would be there, Pavlov? All in all 80,000, 100,000 rubles. A ridiculous sum compared to what the governor is dragging away. What do you think we should have done, Pavlov? We should have packed stones in the chest. And if he had noticed? Then he would have treated us to lifelong hard labor. He will be careful. He must spare us. In any case, it's too late now. The train is already on its way to Europe. Then he left 5 hours earlier than was indicated. Yes, the general pushed through. This news was a most unpleasant surprise to Raffles. His whole plan was shattered by it. The train had left with the treasure. Overtaking was impossible. Man must be content with what he has, he heard the district chief say. I hope, by the way, Pavlov, you haven't withheld anything. The villain flinched. And in that involuntary movement it was Bariatinsk as if he heard a metallic sound. As if pieces of gold were clattering to each other. Had he heard correctly? He needed to know more about that. And he resorted to a ruse. Water, water! He exclaimed suddenly, I'm getting so dizzy. The Count staggered, clutched his head and fell on the sofa. What has happened, Your Grace? Cried Pavlov, and flew to Bariatinsk to support him. Now the gold tinkling became distinctly audible in his pockets. The Earl saw his secretary bent over under the burden of the stolen money. Now I have you, wretch! He shouted suddenly in a wild tone. He jumped off the sofa and grabbed Pavlov by the throat. He shook it violently, so that even a few pieces of gold rolled to the ground. Pavlov saw that he was lost. The longing for all the gold that was piled up there clouded his senses. He took a dagger from under his waistcoat and strode blindly to Bariatinsk. But this one was before him. He, too, possessed a weapon, a revolver, and before Pavlov could inflict the fatal stab, Bariatinsk pressed the weapon into his face. The bullet entered Pavlov's left eye. With a roar, Pavlov sank. A veritable rain of gold flowed from his pockets. Chapter 4. Flight and Prosecution. The booming shot had, of course, roused the entire hotel staff. From all the windows the frightened guests looked, and the waiters flew into the garden. They could not see much, however, and it was a while before light was brought to light. Raffles had at once fully surveyed his perilous position. It was impossible for him to stay on the balcony of number 38. Anyone would have connected his presence there with the murder. He was not to be taken into custody at any cost. Every minute, every second for him was precious. Wasn't the train carrying the treasure already tumbling across the plain with furious speed? Nor did he dare return to the balcony of number 39. And at any moment the garden could be brightly lit. His condition was more precarious than ever. Number 38 was already invaded from the hallway. Meanwhile, Charlie Brand was in 1,000 fears. He had gone to the station, as described above, to hear when the corpse would be transported. To his great dismay, he had heard there that the train with the corpse of the general had already left. He was desperate and disappointed. Charlie knew all too well how much his friend cared to have gone with him. Fortunately, however, he did not lose all presence of mind. All that mattered here was to gain time. So Brand immediately got into an automobile and whizzed toward the Hotel St. Petersburg, where he flew up the stairs. In his haste he had completely forgotten to pay the driver, and he waited so calmly, thinking that the stranger would need his services still further. Charlie Brand was not a little surprised not to find his friend Edward in the room. He ran to the dining room, the reading room, the conversation room, the writing room. Raffles was not there. No one had seen the gentleman of number 38 leave the hotel. Horrified and alarmed, and without a moment's thought of the waiting car, he flew back to number 38 and packed everything there in case one should suddenly have to leave. When everything was packed, he suddenly fell back into the automobile. His first thought now was to send the driver away as soon as possible. However, he soon abandoned this plan. He had the suitcase brought down and loaded onto the car, then he paid the hotel bill, for he understood that when he returned, Raffles would want to leave at once. After all this was done, Charlie went back to number 39, sat down on the sofa and waited dead calm what would happen next. Suddenly a noise was heard in the adjoining room. Then a shot cracked and the jingling sound of money. Charlie ran to the window, for voices were heard in the garden. There he suddenly saw a dark figure flying through the sky. The blood was in his veins. That black shadow was a man. Almighty God! Charlie exclaimed, and covered his face with his hands so as not to see that the unfortunate fell to his death. But there was no cry for help and no dull blow. Only something flew over his head, and he heard the soft but clear whispered words. "Charlie, take the rope ladder and wait for me with hat and coat in our room." That was Edward's voice, Charlie gasped tonelessly. Mechanically he drew in the rope ladder and put it in the pocket. No sooner had he re-entered the room than came from the other side Lord Lister, elegantly dressed, the cigarette between his lips, smiling all over the world with distinguished contempt. Raffles had gone through the gutter which he had reached by the fire escape ladder, then he had climbed through a hatch and with the continuous elevator he reached the floor where he had to be. Dead calm, he had then gone to his room. Charlie was dumbfounded. And besides, he did not know how to impart the job tidings to his friend. But Raffles beat him. "The train has already left, Charlie. Do you already know that? From whom? Don't care. But keep calm, man. We must catch up with the train." "To catch up? That is totally impossible." Charlie, however, followed his friend into the hallway, where the greatest confusion reigned. The police were busy and all exits were blocked. However, it occurred to no one to hold the distinguished Lord Lister and his secretary, and while all the hotel attendants bowed deeply, the gentleman left the building. "To the station," Charlie ordered. The car chugged away. Raffles did not let the motorcar drive in front of the main entrance, a little before he had already stopped. He then quickly entered the telegraph office. The train to Krasnoyarsk left at 7:45 minutes, so 5 hours earlier than stated. Where is he now? The officer consulted a map. About between Cherenkov and Kurlitz. Isn't he over Kurlitz yet?
No. Then I would have already received a telegraphic message. Good. Then telegraph quickly. The train must be delayed until Grand Duke Peter Andriju has arrived with his adjutant. 2 compartments facing each other, each with 2 beds, must be reserved for the Grand Prince in the front sleeping car. The officer bowed deeply. He did not doubt for a moment that before him stood the aide-de-camp to the Grand Duke. Yet he replied in a humble but determined tone. "I may not transmit your telegram without the station master's permission." Now Raffles changed his tactics. He knew that with Russian officials one must work with the note and the ruble. Lord Lister did both. He handed the officer a note of 100 rubles and threateningly held out a revolver to him. "Telegraph at once, you dog pale, or I'll shoot you as if you'd gone mad." The officer turned pale, but he did what was required and commanded. When this was done, Raffles said, "And now don't you dare to cancel this first by a second telegram. It would irrevocably kill you." Raffles left. He was convinced that the telegraph operator would not send a second telegram. He immediately took his place in the car again, after ordering the driver to drive to Cheremkao. Chapter 5. A car tour through Siberia. The driver was not a little upset about this assignment. He stated that this journey was extremely expensive, since the return journey had to be paid for and a supply of petrol had to be bought at least 10 times as much. "All devils!" burst out Raffles, "bring as much gas as you like. I didn't ask for a price. Do you think Grand Duke Peter Andrew, whose aide I am, is such a bald jackal as you are? Forward." The driver bowed deeply. Then he whizzed away. It should be noted here that the major highways in Siberia are in excellent condition and are therefore eminently suitable for automobile trips, if one leaves the robbers and wolves aside. Before the Great Siberian Railway was opened in January 1899, these highways were the only thoroughfares, which were thus well maintained by the state. In a short time a huge stock of petrol had been put in place and the journey was started. Before accompanying the two friends further on their journey, we must consider what happened in the Hotel St. Petersburg, as some of the persons present there will arouse our interest later. When the police inspector broke into room 38 to find out what had happened, he was suddenly confronted, to his great surprise, with his superior, Count Baryatinsk. Pavlov, the sole witness to the murder, for no mortal knew of Raffles' presence on the balcony, was dead. Standing tall in the room, Count Baryatinsk said, "A horrible murder has been committed here. I was just getting there when the killer disappeared through the balcony door. It is a mystery to me how the fellow escaped, but he must still be in the house." "The exits of the hotel are guarded," said the police inspector. "I will investigate everything." "Do that. Here's the revolver with which the killer shot his victim." The Count gave his own weapon. And as Raffles and Charlie Brand rushed along, the entire St. Petersburg Hotel was turned upside down in Irkutsk. The killer must have somehow gotten to the balcony, where he'd seen his victim counting money, until he broke in and shot the man. It was wondered what a breakneck leap the murderer must have taken, and it was concluded that it must have been a shrewd burglar who had gone to work here. The police got to work. All her inquiries, however, led to nothing, and it was never thought that the distinguished gentleman, who had lodged with his secretary at 39, could know anything about this dark deed. Raffles leaned back in the car at his leisure. Charlie Brand, on the other hand, became more and more nervous. "You still drive me mad, Charlie," began Raffles. "You seem silly. I understand it even less today than I used to. Edward, what does this mad trip mean? What do you want in the nest Cheremkao, which is located in the middle of the steppe?" "I want to freshen up." "Is that why you go to that poor Siberian village?" "There must be an inn to be found." "I think so too. But it's a hole, you know." Is that the only reason?" "And why not?" "Because it's insane." "Thank you." "No thanks." "Say, Charlie. Please." "It's not the only reason." "I thought so. I intend to meet Grand Duke Peter Andrew in that nest." "You? John Raffles?" "Yes, I. But not as John Raffles, but as Theodore Timofeyev." "Why?" "Because under that name I took a job as adjutant." "You? A job as adjutant? By Grand Duke Peter Andrew?" "As I said." "And what should all this mean? Who is that Grand Prince anyway?" "You." "I?" Charlie cried out. He was terrified beyond words. "You don't seem to be able to play your part very well yet." "No. I have no talent for it, Raffles. I don't get it again, Edward." "See, Charlie, you're still a silly child. Have you ever watched a Grand Duke or some other great lord?" "I believe we have had occasion to do so on our international travels." "Then you've been paying very little attention, Charlie." "Why?" "Because otherwise you had to know that the adjutant is actually the leading person, while the Grand Duke is nothing but the mannequin." "I understand you. So you want to have your hands free and treat me like a doll?
Not like a doll,
Charlie,
but like a prince.
that is the same.
Now you have understood me.
But don't you think our car is driving terribly slow? And with these words he opened the door and climbed upon the trestle. Chapter 6. A pitying automotive.
The driver was not a little surprised at this passenger's action.
Lord Lister, however, gave him no time to show this astonishment,
but asked him why he was not speeding.
"It is dark already,"
came the reply.
"there is so little to see on the road."
"But man, then you're blind. I'll show you how to drive."
Lord Lister took the wheel.
And now the cart rushed forward at double speed. But stop. What was that? A thick cloud of dust billowed up, the engine puffed with such force that an explosion seemed inevitable. Charlie let out a cry of terror and flew from his seat. The driver came into the road with a large bend. The car stopped. Raffles had stopped hastily, for despite the prevailing darkness he had seen a woman and 2 children fall in front of the vehicle. The unfortunate had wanted to take her own life with her sprouts. She was now lying in the middle of the road with her crying little one. Raffles picked up the children first and put them in the car. He told Charlie to comfort them, for they trembled with terror. The poor woman was behaving like a madman. She reproached Raffles in many words for having stopped the car so that she and her children had not met the death she had longed for. "My dear, good woman," said Raffles in answer to the gross reproach, "is your sorrow so great that I cannot help ease it? Tell me what drove you to this act of despair. Do you know that it is very sinful to take your own and your children's lives?" "I did it because I love my children. Because I wanted to end their miserable existence. It is better to die thus than to starve to death." "So is it the hunger? If that is your greatest concern, I can soon deliver you from it." "You? Will you deliver us from the hunger that tortures us, as far as our memory lasts?" "Yes, good woman, I want that. I will take care of you and your children. Is your husband still alive?" The poor woman nodded in agreement. Tears choked her voice. "My poor husband is at home exhausted. He will soon die, and to escape further misery I wanted to take my own life with my children." "Then it is high time we rescued your husband." Raffles sat down at the wheel again and had the woman sit beside him so that she might show him the way. The poor slave told him sad things along the way. The whole government had been drained, as the population had to pay insanely high taxes. The last kopecks were taken from them, the last cow, the last goat taken from the stable and driven on. No wonder the peasants were enraged, as nearly all of them had been led to beggars. When the rescued woman heard that she would receive from Lord Lister enough money to live quite carefree for a few months, she could not believe the glad tidings at first. John Raffles then gave her a purse full of gold pieces, that she might see that he was very serious. Then the disastrous burst into a wild roar and kissed the purse. After some time the car drove into a village which looked deplorable and neglected, and Lord Lister took the woman and children to a barracks in which there was no furniture. On a bed of polluted straw lay the father of the household, who was utterly exhausted from lack of food. The noble benefactor gave the poor wretch, who could not realize his happiness, a large sum of money, and then went to the starosta, the mayor of the village. This one, a venerable old man, stooped deeply under care and concern. He had not gone to rest, though midnight was long past. The misfortune that had struck the fellow villagers kept sleep from his eyes. The starosta was greatly astonished at this sudden help. He knelt down and began to pray in a louder voice. When he had recovered somewhat from his surprise, the master thief gave him 5,000 rubles, along with a sealed letter in which he had written a few words. Brand wanted to look over his friend's shoulder. "Don't be curious, Charlie. You'll hear soon enough what's in this letter." "And why must it remain a secret until so long?" "Because it would excite you too much." That was just cause for the nervous Brand to be excited. Raffles took no notice, however. He said to the starosta, "Do not open this letter until you are in council. Farewell." The old man wanted to express his immense gratitude. Raffles did not wait for that, however. "What are you doing mysteriously?" growled Charlie. "Why do you keep giving me riddles?" "I don't think of giving you riddles. I would even find it much better if you meddled a little less with things that don't concern you. And now get in, Charlie, we must go to Cherumcow as soon as possible."
We've been here far too long. At least tell me what you want in Cheramkao. John Raffles smiled. Tomorrow you will learn everything, Grand Duke Peter and Rave, for as such you can order your aide, Theodore Timofeyev, to tell what he knows. With these words, Lord Lister pushed the stunned secretary into the wagon, sprang upon the trestle, and in the next instant the motorcar was again running through the darkness. Chapter 7. The Grand Queen and His Adjutant. The bright morning shone in all its splendor as the automobile pulled into Cheramkao, where the vehicle stopped in front of a humble inn. It was a remote village, made up of wooden houses. Charlie Brand was feverishly excited. He knew his friend was about to play some crazy trick, but what would actually happen was a complete mystery to him. Why did this little nest have to be held up? It was due to the railway, but the train had long passed. And what was the meaning of that mysterious letter? When the car stopped, Raffles jumped from the box, took off his hat, and whispered to Brand. "Charlie, put on a haughty face, look as contemptuous and contemptible as possible, talk only to me, meddle in nothing and no one. In a word, play the Grand Prince." Brand was so astonished at the first moment that he thought he was going to collapse. But Lord Lister's tone was so decided that Charlie immediately moved into the part assigned to him. The innkeeper almost bowed to the ground when he heard the guests coming to dwell under his humble roof. He had never been given such an honor. He ran through his house to please the guests, for the adjutant had ordered food and drink, also for the driver. The innkeeper's eyes opened still wider when, on his return, he saw the Grand Prince in robes. He had put on the uniform of the Kaluga regiment. When the travelers had refreshed themselves, they set out again, and from a distance they saw the train at the station, about which Brand could not be surprised enough. There was great excitement at the station, for the travelers were not at all excited that they should be delayed here. Lord Lister had gone straight to the station master. "The Grand Duke is not feeling too well," he said. "He will go straight to the sleeping car. Is it ready?" "Certainly, Your Grace. Shall I show you the compartment?" "Wait a second. I will ask His Excellency what he wishes." Governor Ortchkov had meanwhile also appeared, and he followed the adjutant like a dog. He felt very uneasy and, in spite of the prevailing cold, large beads of sweat beaded on his face. The station master, too, was uneasy, albeit for entirely different reasons. His fear did not diminish when he noticed that the adjutant had a special interest in the transport of bodies. He allowed himself to be shown the freight wagon, and the remark told him that the honor guard over the corpse was very large and beautiful. "If you had the whole coffin full of gold," said the master thief to the governor, "you could not have her more carefully guarded than the dead general now." The governor paled. The adjutant's remark had struck him like lightning. It made him dizzy for a moment. But when he looked up, his startled eyes only stared into a smiling, uninhibited face. John Raffles knew enough. He was now sure that the coffin was filled with gold. He let the governor go with a wave of his hand, and spoke in a benevolent tone. "I will report to the Grand Prince." Ortchkov took a deep breath. The master thief now showed himself the divisions reserved for him and the Grand Duke. He did not seem pleased with it, and Raffles Timofeyev simply stated that he would not dare to offer the Grand Duke this space. The station master simply didn't know what to do. It is simply impossible to mock a Russian Grand Duke. But nothing happened. The aide seemed to be a very kind gentleman indeed. He was content to have a separate sleeping car hooked up for the Grand Duke. He pointed to the spot in front of the freight wagon in which the coffin was carried as a place. The chief was glad to see him come out like that, and everything was immediately arranged as the adjutant wished. The travelers took a deep breath. They understood that they would soon leave Kuchalik. Meanwhile the pseudo-Grand Prince was pacing restlessly in the waiting room like a hyena in his cage. He had been brought by Raffles into a condition in which he did not belong at all. His friend finally arrived. He closed the door, got into military stance, knocked, and announced in a curt, businesslike tone. "Everything is all right, Your Highness. The sleeping car is being hooked up, we can leave in 15 minutes. All you devils, Edward, stop the madness!" Charlie burst out. "Would you like to tell me what all this fuss means?" "I told you, Charlie, I must have the body." "What corpse?" "That lies in the coffin which Governor Ortchkov takes away." I thought there was gold in that coffin.
All the better.
Then I'll take the gold instead of the corpse. I see the train is ready. Our suitcases are already being loaded. I have to supervise that as adjutant. You must play Grand Prince, Charlie. Above all, make a suffering face and be too ill to greet anyone. Remember. Raffles was out the door before Brand could hold him. Lord Lister rewarded the driver so lavishly that the man bowed in half. Charlie's paleness was now completely gone. Rather, he had blushed with nervous tension and saluted with distinguished contempt. The train could now depart. Raffles gave leave to the station master to give the signal, and soon the locomotive started moving along the smooth rails, trying to make up for the delay by redoubled speed. Chapter 8. Dangerous. Lord Lister, with a sigh, fell back into the soft cushions of a first-class compartment, in which he was, of course, alone with Brand, and stretched out his legs comfortably. "I made the greatest sacrifice after all," he said with a sarcastic laugh. "Why?" "Because I haven't been able to smoke a cigarette all this time. As an aide-de-camp in the service of the Grand Ducal, it is impossible for me to do that. But I will now make up for my loss." "Have you still not given up on the insane plan of looting that coffin?" "Do I look, Charlie, as if I were going to give up on a plan? And besides, what I intend to do is by no means, not at all crazy." Charlie Brand shrugged. "From a closed coffin, guarded by soldiers, would you steal the treasure? It all comes down to how you do it, old boy. If you were willing to take the risk, I'd think you're crazy. I have no idea how you're going to fix it." "I understand that. It's life-threatening." "Indeed. But how do you proceed?" "I won't tell you." "Why not?" "Because then you would make me look like a madman." "Is it that bad?" "Not for me, but for you." Charlie swung back and forth in place. Lord Lister, on the other hand, sat dead calm and cut the ashes from his cigarette. "The worst thing about this whole thing," he said, "when they find in Irkutsk that the whole story of the Grand Prince and the telegram is a fraud." Fire was startled. "Did you do that?" Lister snickered gleefully. "Then we may be exposed at any moment." Are you so indifferent to that, Charlie? What should I do? I can't get out, can I? What if we are discovered now?" "Yes, what then, Edward? Come on, it won't go so fast. In any case, nothing will happen to us tonight. We'll have the booty early tomorrow." Charlie Brand shook his head in disbelief. He still tried to keep his friend from the foolish plan. But this one remained inexorable. "Then let me help you. If I need your help, I'll gladly use it. In this case, however, two loads of, besides, the labor is as breakneck as you can imagine. But I can't stay here when you're in danger. It certainly won't get any easier if you, too, end up in peril for no purpose." "But what shall I do, Edward?" "If you want to do something by all means, while I'm outside, look out the window. Maybe you can help me or take something away from me. And now let's get into the dining car. Then we go to sleep and then—" Fire jumped up. "Always calm, Grand Duke Peter Andrew," said the adjutant soothingly. "Never forget what you owe to your rank. Calm is necessary first of all. Where shall I get it, when the sword of Damocles hangs over your head?" The gentleman went to the lorry. Charlie Brand didn't enjoy the delicious food much, but Raffles put up a good fight and made no mistake. Evening dusk settled over the Siberian landscape, causing the train to roll on, as the false Grand Prince and his adjutant returned to the sleeping car. "Look," said John Raffles, "now let's make ourselves a little comfortable, and pack our bags so that we can get off the train any minute when the police are on our track. We can rest for 3 hours and then get to work." The master thief then went to sleep calmly and peacefully, and at 11 o'clock in the morning he awoke again, the hour he had chosen to carry out his plan. Charlie Brand, however, tossed restlessly on his couch. It was impossible for him to fall asleep. 1,000 things whirled through his mind, and when he finally fell asleep about 10:30, he dreamed of a Grand Duke, of a poor peasant woman with 2 children, of a telegraph operator in Irkutsk, of the innkeeper in Cheremkovo, of the starosta with the letter and of a mob of policemen, who transported him to Siberia, where he had been banished to lifelong hard labor as a criminal. John Raffles alone he did not see, and in vain called him. At last he awoke, bathed in sweat. Lord Lister stood before him, the inseparable cigarette in his mouth. "It's time, Charlie. I'm going to get the gold." Brand sprang from his couch. He wanted to warn his friend again, but a single glance at his determined features warned him not to do this. Carefully Raffles lowered the large window to the side of the train, which was not lit by the bright moonlight, and gazed into the dark night. The train thundered along the rails. And now Raffles began the perilous work. He clambered through the window and scrambled along the train. Brand watched him with his heart beating anxiously. Suddenly Raffles was gone. Brand couldn't suppress a scream. The terror had swept him to the core, his temples were throbbing, it was as if he were going mad. Fortunately no mortal had heard his cry of terror. It had been lost in the sniffing and thumping of the train. Charlie flew to the other side of the train, where the moon shone brightly on the plain. There was also nothing to discover from Raffles here. Now the train turned to the right. But what was that? What was there on the rails? Something black? And it did not move, like a man badly wounded, run over? The secretary looked and looked. But the train rushed on and on, and the black spot disappeared into the night mists. Had it been Lord Lister? It was very likely, because he was nowhere to be found. For a long time Charlie Brand stared out into the night, until his eyes began to water with exertion. He did not see his friend again. Then he was overcome with grief. He closed the window, sat down on the soft cushions and wept sadly, like a child. Outside, the wheels sang their monotonous, jerking song, and in nagging rhythms the train thundered on, clattering. Chapter 9. A creepy hero piece. Now let us follow the brave clamber on his grisly journey. The master thief had climbed out of the window and was now walking along the footboards of the train. The thick, petroleum vapor-laden air threatened to suffocate him. But John Raffles clambered on. He pressed himself close to the side of the wagon so as not to be noticed by anyone by chance. Now he had reached the end of the carriage. Behind it, on which he now stood, was the freight wagon with the coffin hooked. A triumphant smile crossed his face. Now he was at the target. There was the place where the treasure was hidden. He stood before him. And no living soul, Charlie Brand excepted, suspected that he was so close to the mark. But how was he supposed to get there? The wagon's footboard ended here. Jumping onto the freight wagon was impossible. Raffles leaned back to see between the two wagons. There were the buffers and the coupling, which formed a good connection from one wagon to the next. If, however, one misstepped, if one slipped or was shaken from the train by the swinging to and fro and fell on the rails, a horrible death would inevitably follow. The hardest part was the jump from the footboard to on the buffer of the wagon. This jump had to be made around the corner. If the foot slipped, death would immediately follow. The master thief jumped. For a moment he floated in the air, then he came down, and he managed to regain his balance in time. This was the moment Brand had seen his friend, who was then hidden from Charlie's eye by the rear wall of the carriage. Raffles now climbed farther along the wagon, and soon succeeded in finding the place where the coffin was hidden. The master thief had hung around a large leather sack used to hide the treasure. He had drills, jigsaws, pliers, a thief's lantern and a bow. The bottom of the freight car was made of wood of a reasonable thickness, but it could not withstand steel implements. Soon Raffles, who had fastened himself to anchors and springs with ropes, had tied himself up in a lying position. Now he could start working with the jigsaw. The noise of the work was unintelligible because of the terrible noise that the train was making. It was not too long, then, before John Raffles had cut a round hole in the bottom of the freight car, large enough for his hand to pass through. He kept the piece of wood to glue it back together later, when the robbery was done. The opening had been sawn just below the coffin. Now Raffles had free rein. But there the train was approaching a station. The locomotive whistled, the brake was applied, the tremendous speed diminished, and at last the train came to a complete standstill. That was a dangerous situation. As long as the train was at full speed, Raffles had no fear of discovery. But he could be seen at the station. He hastily untied the ropes with which he had tied himself. Then he slid to the ground and climbed to the side where there were no people. While the train was stationary for a while, Raffles looked around to get a good look at the situation. The freight car in which the coffin lay was only dimly lit. The soldiers stood in front of the compartment doors and looked out over the plain. They cared little for the remains of the dead general. Why too? Those bones wouldn't run away fast. Charlie Brand had taken advantage of the train's delay to quickly get out of the compartment and look after his friend. He walked cautiously to the freight wagon in which the body was hidden, and then pretended that something of his had fallen to the ground so that he could see beneath the wagon. But Raffles was nowhere to be found. He was and remained gone. Heartbroken, Charlie returned to the wagon reserved for the Grand Duke, and sank to the cushions, utterly broken. When the signal to leave was given, Raffles crawled out again and went to his old place. Now he could clear the last obstacle. He sawed a round opening in the coffin, and there flowed like a golden flood the glittering coins into the leather case. It was fortunate that the train made such a deafening noise and completely drowned out the sound of the coins. The leather bag could scarcely bear the golden burden. Raffles had to get this first part of the loot to safety before he got more. He tied the woolen cloth so that it caught the outflowing gold, and then clambered back to the Grand Regal compartment. Charlie Brand couldn't speak for joy when he saw his friend climb in through the window. He fell on his neck and expressed his joy in a wild manner. "Leave that, Charlie. There is no time for that now," laughed Raffles. "Get the gold to safety as soon as possible. Put it in our suitcases. I have to go back to get a new supply." "What? Do you want to take that mad trip again?" "I have to. For at the same time I want to make the traces of the theft disappear." "You're going to lose your life." "Don't worry, Charlie. Give me some wood glue." Charlie did it. "We have to hurry up a bit. If a telegraph is sent from Irkutsk, you should be able to get off the train as soon as possible." "What? Only me?" "Yes." "And why? Why don't we go together?" "Because that probably isn't possible." Raffles climbed back to the coffin, again looted a large stock of gold pieces, and then glued the cut-out portion back into the wood. Then he went back to Charlie Brand. "It is high time, Charlie. The train will soon stop at Coffin station. There we get out, I quickly change my clothes and ride on like an English aristocrat. You go back to Irkutsk with the suitcases and then stay as Mr. Fire at Hotel de Londres." "Should I go back to Irkutsk?" "Yes." "What am I to do there?" "I already told you, you must like Mr. Fire staying at Hotel des Londres." "Yes, but why that?" "Because that is part of my plan." "Always those diabolical schemes of yours, Edward. Without plans one gets to nothing, Charlie." The train whistled. "Come on, Charlie, change your clothes." Chapter 10. Travel companion that was not welcome. The train left Coffin station, and an elegant Englishman sat down next to the governor in his compartment. His Excellency looked anything but friendly as this tour group boarded. Raffles, of course, pretended not to notice. "Lord Curzon," he said with a distinguished air. Ortchkov also mentioned his name. John Raffles sat down opposite the governor. He took out his cigarette case, opened it and held it out to his traveling companion. "Can I serve you?" he asked. Ortchkov took a cigarette. He was very pleased with his new companion, who certainly belonged to the leading circles of England. That distinguished young man did not inspire the slightest suspicion. It was a tedious journey, why not start a conversation with each other? "Do you travel for pleasure, Lord?" the Russian officer asked. Instead of answering, Raffles asked a question in return. "Allow me to ask a question before I answer you? You introduced yourself as Baron Ortchkov. Are you perhaps the governor of Irkutsk?" "Indeed," replied the Baron, a little surprised. "Did you know that?" "Yes, I knew that. I even believe that I will have to deal with you in the course of my profession." "What do you mean by that?" Ortchkov asked in a restless tone. "I am a detective of the English police and sent out to catch the greatest of all crooks, the master thief John C. Raffles." The governor was startled. He remembered that he was carrying the treasure, but in the next instant he was reassured. That English thief couldn't possibly know what was hidden in the coffin. "Would that Raffles be haunting around here?" he asked. "It is indeed suspected that he is on the Siberian Railway, and has even been seen in Irkutsk." "So? Indeed?" "And at a station between Irkutsk and Krasnoyarsk he must have even pretended to be the Grand Duke Peter Andreev." "Helen Devil. shouted the governor. Then the thief has entered the train in Kautulik.
What?
Cried John Raffles. On this train? Secure. The fellow had the audacity to allow himself to be presented as Grand Prince Peter Andrejev by his aide-de-camp. Is an aide with him?
Yes.
He wears the uniform of the Kaluga regiment. And the Grand Prince? He wears the general's uniform of various orders and insignia.
But that's impossible, isn't it? My dear sir,
I have seen the two scoundrels with my own eyes, and have even spoken to one of them. They boarded this train, where a separate wagon was hooked up for the thieves.
But that's ridiculous, asserted the lord in a gleeful tone. The shrewd crook will surely be up to some rascal that he has taken a seat on this train.
Would you think so?
The governor got up.
His face turned dark red and his eyes popped out of their sockets.
I didn't offend you by that statement, did I?
Lord Lister asked, bowing briefly.
No, but I am terribly frightened.
How so? Do you have a large sum of money with you?
That's right.
Not more or less than the tax revenue of the Holy Irkutsk government for the whole quarter.
I have to hand over the money to the Russian government.
You personally, Lord Governor?
Yes, I cannot trust anyone.
Our officers cannot be trusted.
The governor condemned himself with this remark.
He had taken on the transport of the money in order to steal as much of it himself as possible.
Raffles couldn't help but smile. You must have made sure, my Lord Governor, he said, that the money is well put away. I do not know whether it is known to you that nothing is safe from this genius thief. But that's terrible, cried Ortchkov, paling again, but I have secured my treasure so well that there is no thought of theft, Lord. And how did you do this, General? I'll tell you. Because you're actually my ally. I put the money in a coffin, which apparently contains the corpse of my deceased uncle. Soldiers with loaded guns keep an eye on it. And do you think that by such means you can hold back the shrewd Raffles? No, General. He has accomplished other things. The governor was speechless. Deathly white, his mouth open, he stared at Raffles. You want to say, he stammered at last. I want to say that John Raffles will certainly get you the money from the coffin, or has already done so. The governor let out a cry. He then jumped up and pulled the emergency brake with all his might. A shrieking whistle sounded from the locomotive, the train's speed diminished, and at last it came to a complete standstill. That was exactly what Raffles had wanted. Time had to be gained and that was the best way to do it. No telegrams could be sent here. John counted on a telegram from Irkutsk to be received at one of the following stations, ordering the imprisoning of the pretended Grand Prince and his aide-de-camp. He had to delay this moment as long as possible, to buy time for Brand as well as for himself to get the loot to safety. Scarcely had the train stopped when the governor rushed to the baggage car, where, in great excitement, he immediately had the coffin opened. A loud scream rang out. Most of the treasure was gone. Only a few pieces of gold still covered the bottom. You scoundrels, where have you put my money? He cried out in anger to the soldiers, who looked at him with stupid faces. Thieves, traitors and spies. You have robbed me. Give the money back, or I swear to you, I'll have you chopped to pieces. The hapless dragoons and Cossacks dared not move, not even when their chief struck and kicked them in his great rage. Now Lord Cruzon also approached the governor. I am convinced that these men are quite innocent, Sir Governor. However, I would have the train searched. If the soldiers, which I do not suppose, have stolen the money, then it must be in the train. Furthermore, it seems to me the most sensible thing to capture the disguised Grand Prince and his aide-de-camp. We will undoubtedly find the missing sum in their luggage. You are right, the Grand Prince, that villain, is the perpetrator. Where is the chief conductor? Roared the general. This one had already appeared. Take me immediately to Grand Duke Peter Andrejev, I want to capture him. The chief conductor replied. His Highness the Grand Prince has already left the train at Korsun station. Only? The general asked. No, with his aide. And with his luggage? Yes, with his luggage. That villain stole my money, roared Ortchkov in a louder voice. There was a loud murmur from the passengers who witnessed this conversation. There was no inclination to swallow this outrageous accusation from one of the members of the imperial family. Now John Raffles stepped forward.
He also wanted to pass for an English detective, that is, an enemy of the master thief, lest he might be suspected of being Raffles himself.
Gentlemen.
So Lord Curzon turned to the excited travelers. There is a misunderstanding here. The general's words, of course, did not refer to the real Grand Prince Peter Andrejeff, but to a crook who travels under his name. The villain, who got out at Coffin, is called John Raffles, and has robbed the governor for several 100,000 rubles. I am a deputy of the police who must arrest him. There was great surprise. I must, of course, return at once to pursue the thief, cried the general, beside himself with anger. Let the train go back. The chief conductor declared that he was not authorized to do so, which resulted in a violent outburst of anger on the part of the general. Again Raffles calmed down. He laid his hand on Ortchkov's shoulder and whispered to him. Come, Lord Governor. Let us not lose our precious time, but ride with us to the next station, where we will get a locomotive. I have a plan by which we will surely find out where the treasure has gone. In any case, I advise you to take with you the little that is left in the coffin. You see, this hiding place has not proved sufficient. The robbed rushed to the baggage car and put the little bit of gold that was still there in his pocket. In his haste, and in the poor lighting, he paid no attention to the circular incision which could be seen on the bottom of the box and which would not have escaped a careful observation. Ortchkov rushed back to his compartment with his small loot and the train was finally able to start moving again. Chapter 11. A new track. John Raffles now changed his tactics. He sat silently in a corner, like one pondering a profound question, unlike the general, who was pacing excitedly in the compartment. Now? Exclaimed Ortchkov, you don't know what to do either? Yes, it is not easy to catch such a brilliant crook. Thou shalt not do it either, Lord Curzon. I think Raffles is as innocent as I am in this case, replied John, smiling. And you say that? Exclaimed the general, while you told me first that none but Raffles can be the thief? True, but now things are different. Why? Will you make this clear to me? Secure. If you have a little patience. I am very curious. Do you believe that your soldiers stole the money? Frankly, no. Russian officials steal, but Russian soldiers never. Good. I think so too. Who could it have been then? Raffles, of course, shouted the governor. The lord shook his head slowly and replied. Then tell me how Raffles could have stolen the money. How would I know? I'm not a professional thief or burglar. I do not know either. What do you mean by that? That it is impossible to steal your ingenious hideout. The coffin was not damaged anywhere, the soldiers did not leave the chariot, no one has been in the chariot but yourself, so no man could have robbed the coffin. So it seems, but have you any other lead? Secure. It is certain, began Raffles with the acumen of a judge, that the theft cannot have been committed during the voyage. But since the treasure has been stolen, it must have been done before that time. You mean, the governor burst out, that Count Baryatinsk is the culprit? The same. But how would he kill? Simple. He has not supplied you with a full box, but only packed what you have found in it. Unheard of. So that would be the vilest deception, raged the general. But what should I do? I have no proof and the rich will deny everything. No doubt he will, but he must be captured. If he really stole, and I don't doubt it, he'll never admit it. It just comes down to how the matter is handled. Do you think you can do it? I'd have to be a bad detective if I couldn't. But what will it help? Of course he has already secured the stolen items. The general knew from his own experience how to deal with withheld funds. There are means of bringing even the boldest criminal to confession, said Raffles calmly. His bad conscience will play a big part. We'll see if my remedy helps. I will ride with you to Irkutsk. That pleases me. Thou art a good fellow, Lord. We will both become good friends. In the meantime it had become perfect day. Raffles went with the governor to the dining car, where, as was the Russian custom, they drank the tea. The conversation of all the travelers naturally revolved around what had happened that night, so in the first place Raffles, the fearless thief, was admired more than he was feared, for all had noticed that they themselves had not been robbed. The general was little complained about, for the money that had been stolen had belonged to the government, and the latter could bear the loss. People laughed at the wonderfully successful ruse with the coffin. Verily, the robbery of the coffin guarded by soldiers was a masterpiece. The young detective, who whispered so intimately to the governor, was widely lamented. Would this very elegant, but apparently so insignificant little man be a match for the great Raffles? No, no, with good manners, a neat toilet and good cigarettes, Raffles was not caught. About 8 o'clock the train arrived in Nishnadinsk, a place on the river Uda-Ortshuna. Here a new surprise awaited. The train was not allowed to enter the station immediately, but was allowed to stand about 100 meters away. There seemed to be a whole army stationed there. Police officers, gendarmes, and secret agents were there, and a whole company of Cossacks surrounded the grounds so that no mouse could have escaped. As Raffles had suspected, the pseudo-Grand Prince's conduct had already become known and telegraphic measures had been taken to apprehend the criminal and his accomplice. Unfortunately, as so often happens, all the effort was for nothing. The daring one, who always sought his victims among the guilty, had escaped. The chief conductor announced that he and his adjutant had already left the train in Coffin, to go hunting, it was said. Immediately telegraphic messages were sent to that place. At the same time, the police searched the train closely. Anyone who did not have sufficient identity documents with them was irrevocably imprisoned. Raffles, of course, had full papers in Lord Curzon's name, and as he had no baggage with him, he was left completely untouched. Governor Ortchkov, meanwhile, took the opportunity to report the theft to the chief police in Nishnadinsk. If he actually got the money from Count Baryatinsk with the help of Lord Curzon, he intended to withhold all of this amount. Baryatinsk would be careful not to betray him, and the theft of taxes on the Siberian Railway had been officially established. Now he could fish beautifully in murky waters and get double the booty. Much to the chagrin of the travelers, everything in the train was thoroughly examined. The wagons were completely emptied, suitcases, travel bags, hat boxes, even umbrella cases, everything was searched, and this was not always done with the same care. Raffles, smoking a cigarette, sauntered back and forth slowly, as if all history had interested him. On the contrary, he objected to the unnecessary delay which he was forced to make while invoking his title of lordship. At last he got it to the point that he and the governor were allowed to go their way. Chapter 12. Foiled Hope. Governor Ortchkov saw to it that the retreat to Irkutsk could take place as quickly as possible. He burned with the desire to charge the treacherous district chief and get the stolen back from him. He could not and would not wait for the next train, so he had an extra train put together, consisting of locomotive, tender and a single saloon carriage. In this he undertook the retreat with Raffles. The 6 soldiers and the clergyman were to follow on the next regular train. Towards evening they arrived in the capital, just as the district chief was preparing to go to the casino, where he had presumably offered a large part of the money which he had extorted from the peasants to the game devil. Count Baryatinsk was not a little surprised to see the governor, whom he already suspected in Krasnoyarsk, so suddenly before him. The general immediately fell for the door. "You must be surprised, Count Baryatinsk, at my visit. I was going to beg you to give me the money you forgot to pack." The district chief turned ashen in the face. He was conscious of no guilt in this, for he had generously given the governor his share of the spoils. "Governor," he began, "I do not know how to take your words. You forget, moreover, to introduce me to your guide. This is the English detective Lord Curzon, who is on the trail of the great John Raffles. I met the Lord on the train. He was the person who advised me to examine the coffin more closely." "And what interest did he have in that?" the Earl asked sharply. "We reasoned about the master thief." "Then it will most certainly have robbed your greenhouse." "That's what we thought in the beginning. But the coffin had not been opened and was still completely screwed shut. The Cossacks did not for a moment leave the treasure. So the money must have been missing, Count Baryatinsk, before the box was placed in the freight car." "Monsieur Governor." The chief became furious. "How can you accuse me of such a low prank? Do you think I embezzled the money?" The governor became much calmer and more moderate by this sally. He even ordered John Raffles to go into the adjoining room for a moment, as he had a few things to discuss with the chief. Lord Lister bowed and left the drawing room. The governor had thought that the count would be baking sweet rolls by now. But the count was really innocent in this. and he stated plainly that he had no intention of paying even a kopeck in compensation. That infuriated the governor. Not a single kopeck, Count? Don't forget that I am your chief and can fire you at any moment. You will not, Monsieur Governor, replied Bariatinsk, in a cold, cutting tone. Why not? Are you still asking? Of course. Well, because it would cost you your job too. For the very moment that you were to dismiss me from office, I should send a letter to the government, in which I simply stated that Governor Ortchkov is my accomplice. Not only has he known all about my dereliction of duty, but he has imposed taxes and stolen large sums. The governor let out a moaning sound. Yes. It was only too true. He was an accomplice. He'd robbed and cheated, and now it was difficult for him to become the prosecutor. Bariatinsk asked, Do you maintain your resolve, Monsieur Governor, to charge me? No, no, said Ortchkov in a dull tone, I will not press charges against you. Everything stays the same. The Count's face shone with devilish joy. He let his boss out the door. Now? Raffles asked the latter with light mockery. He knew, of course, how that conversation should end. The general did not dare to look at the lord. Now? He asked again. What is it? How has it been with the earl? There is nothing to do with him. I give up. What? Has he not known anything? Does he not want to pay? No kopeck. No kopeck? No. That's a nice lot. Then we must force him to do it. For God's sake, don't do that. It wouldn't help. I do believe he is innocent this time. The damned Raffles must have found a way to force the coffin. Raffles and always Raffles? I will prove to you that Count Bariatinsk is the only culprit. No, no. Better come along. Leave him alone. He would take revenge. To whom? To me. Aren't you his chief? Secure. Then you have no fear of revenge either. Anyway, Monsieur Governor, you have to fear him only if you are his accomplice. Ortchkov flinched. Raffles noticed. However, he pretended not to notice and continued. And of course there can be no question of that, Baron Ortchkov. No, no. Certainly not. Of course not. But come now. The case bores me terribly. Not until Count Bariatinsk has cleared the stolen money. What? Did you not understand me, Baron? Asked. Ortchkov was close to despair. Wait here a moment, Baron, I'll go and talk to Count Bariatinsk. It will not be long. The governor stood petrified. Every word had hit him like a punch. It's over, he muttered. St. George, what will happen now? I am a lost man. Chapter 13. How John Raffles was justice. Raffles had gone into the room of the district chief. What do you want here? The earl asked him in a stern tone. You will certainly allow me to take a seat? Asked Raffles in a courteous tone. It is not customary in wealthy circles to leave the guest standing, especially when one is sitting himself. A look of flaming hatred shot from the earl's eyes. You are not my guest. You are an intruder, roared Bariatinsk. Leave immediately. Just a moment, Count. I have but a small matter to settle with you. But I have no desire to reason with you. I'm sorry. Why? Because I should like you to give me some clarification. Clearance? Yes. Me to you? Yes, thou to me. And if I refuse? Then I shall turn to another. To that. Excellent. And to whom would you turn? Are you interested in knowing that? Maybe I should turn to your secretary Pavlov, Earl. The Earl was startled and winced. What? How did that stranger come to mention this very name? Perhaps he knew more than was good? Raffles was already at the door. Have you anything else to say to me? Then the Count asked suddenly. Take a seat a moment more. Lord Curzon turned slowly. Then he complied with the invitation. I have, he began, stayed a few days in the Hotel St. Petersburg. The Count paled. Hotel St. Petersburg? What had he done there? I do not know whether it is known to you, Earl, that thieves, swindlers, murderers, unfaithful officials, and the like prefer to lodge in hotels to conduct their shady dealings. That is, so to speak, impartial territory. The Count grew even paler.
You see what pale,
Count, are you perhaps a little ill?
Indeed,
I'm feeling a little stressed in the last days. The collection of taxes must be very tiring,
Count.
These broke out in a sweat of fear. He felt that he was cornered. Raffles, began Lord Lister.
What have I to do with that Raffles? He doesn't interest me.
Maybe it is. I would stay at the Hotel St. Petersburg to track down the master thief. One day I made a mistake in the number of the room. I wanted to spy on the rogue from the balcony. From the balcony?
Yes.
That was a famous idea of mine,
wasn't it? And I saw wonderful things.
Count Bariatinsk had his eyes wide open. Now he understood what Lord Curzon was referring to.
But the Earl, when his safety was at stake, did not shrink from a second murder. Lord Curzon continued.
I then scrambled down the roof until I thought I had reached the balcony where I could spy on Raffles.
And I witnessed a murder. A murder?
Yes,
Count. A murder for money.
And I recognized the murderer. Lord Lister had sprung up. But the Earl, too, had risen from his seat, and, clutching the paper cutter convulsively, he charged at the detective.
Die,
wretch! He hissed hoarsely.
Dig no further.
And Raffles shoved his revolver under his nose.
That helped.
Throw that knife away,
Count.
Bariatinsk did it. I charge you,
Count Bariatinsk, with committing murder if you refuse to accept my proposals.
And those are?
They are very plausible. You must only part with the money that you extorted from the peasants. Are you ready for that? Yes.
Good.
Then put it here on the table. The governor will take it.
The governor?
That? Leave that to me.
Will you give the money or not?
Yes.
With trembling hands the Earl closed the safe and took out the stolen gold for which he had shot Pavlov. Is that all you stole,
Count?
Everything. Raffles now called the governor.
This one was not a little surprised that he had to come.
Raffles spoke.
Count Bariatinsk was mistaken. He hereby gives you the missing money. You can take it. The Baron did. We will stay at the Hotel de Londres, if it is all right with you, Monsieur Governor. You will certainly travel tomorrow on the evening express train to Krasnoyarsk. I'll take you to the train with your money, just in case. In the hotel Charlie was overjoyed to see his friend back in one piece. But the governor, too, was delighted that he had come into possession of a treasure in such an unexpected way. He took a deep breath as the express train set into motion the following evening. And what do we do now? Asked Brand. You must send a telegram, Charlie. I myself prefer not to go into the telegraph office. The officer might recognize me one day. Charlie looked surprised when he read to whom the telegram was addressed. Is that the Starost to whom you gave the secret letter? Precisely. And may I now at last know what that writing entailed? Yes, you can. Charlie listened intently. It said in the letter, said Raffles, that I should inform the Starost the exact time when the governor would travel through that region with the extorted tax money. The peasants will then, masked of course, stop the train and take the villain's booty again. A letter, which they hand over to the exploiter of mine, will prevent the wicked from raising the issue. You are a madman. Wow, Charlie. That pleases me. And now go with me for a bite to eat. As Raffles had said, it happened. Armed and masked men stopped the train about midnight. They left all the passengers undisturbed, except the general, from whom they took the treasure. Before disappearing again into the dark night, however, they presented the governor with a letter of the following contents. General. The peasants act at my command. They will only take what you and your accomplice Count Bariatinsk have stolen from them. If you make any mention of this matter, I will not hesitate to inform the government of your part in this extortion and your murder of Pavlov. John Raffles, aka Lord Curzon, formerly Grand Duke Peter Andrzej. The end. Thank you for listening to today's episode. I really hoped you enjoyed it. There will be more to come. Please subscribe not to miss out on what is next. I will be looking forward to your return. The music is by Madfan from Pixabay. To support this and other artists, go to pixabay.com. Sheila.